right, so let's get started so we leave enough time for the discussants and also for conversation afterwards, which I think would be very helpful. This is our debate, and I'm sure maybe many of you in high school were part of a debate. All of us have, at least over the past 6 months, seen some debates on television and in our past. Some have been very comical. Some have been very, very, very comical, and some have been more memorable. And for those of you who don't time yourself well, this is the 1988 debate between Lloyd Bentsen and Dan Quayle. And the young senator from Indiana, the deer-in-the-headlights senator, said this: "I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of president of this country. I have as much experience in Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency." This led to probably one of the most famous lines of any debate in history. "Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy." So let's start a little bit with our great debate. It is not the great debate. The great debate is whether one should put the toilet paper on the roll so that it feeds from the top or feeds from the bottom. But nonetheless, we're going to have a great debate today, I think, which is, which grading system is better, normative versus criterion? And the speakers will be myself, who will be speaking on the normative grading prowess, and Dr. Nicki, who will be speaking on criterion grading. A definition of debate to get us all started comes from Merriam-Webster. It's a formal discussion of a motion before a deliberative body according to the rules of parliamentary procedure, or a regulated discussion of a proposition between two matched sides. This is incredibly boring. And so what I would like to do is set up this debate as a little bit more fun, a little bit more rivalrous, a little bit more contentious between the two speakers. Similar to the rivalry between the Steelers and the Browns, the Yankees and the Red Sox, for basketball fans, North Carolina and Duke, and my favorite, the Flyers and the Penguins. The speaker for the the speaker for the criterion side will be Mike Nicki, and I will take the normative side. At the end of the debate, I think this is what Mike will look like. At the end of the debate, I think this is what I will look like, Maria Sharapova-esque. So let's get started. More definitions. What is normative? What is criterion? Mike is going to talk a little bit more about that, but for those who may not have a good background on what the difference between the two is, here it is. Normative grading is relative to others. It assigns a grade to a student's performance, comparing him or her to other students' performance or a performance of another group. That comparison group can be a national reference standard, or it can be a fellow student in the class. You generate a curve, and we're all familiar with the curve and where we stand on the curve, and a grade is assigned based on your distance above and below the mean. So here you have a normal bell-shaped curve. You have a criteria in the center around the mean, which is the peak of the curve, of who passes. Those who fall, for example, below 2 standard deviations below the mean will fail. Those who are, for example, greater than 2 standard deviations above the mean would get an honors, and so the grade is very clean. You could change your standard deviations to 1 above and below to get pass, fail, or honors, but nonetheless, you are comparing yourself to others in the class or others across the country. Criterion grading sets a mastery standard, a, so to speak, bar. It's the what, the how much, and by when do you have to do a particular task or learn a particular fact or set of facts. You either meet the standard or you don't. You compete the standard, not each other. I consider it like a stairs. So you have to get from the basement to the first floor, to get from the first day of medical school to graduation, you have to navigate your standards all the way up those flights of stairs before we let you graduate. So now I'm going to say why we should use normative grading and spend my time doing this. The disclaimer here is that the opinions expressed may not be my opinions, but I will argue very vociferously that they are the correct opinions. Okay, here we go. Reason number 1 is the Sister Liguori reason. There are several people who say that normative grading is bad because it breeds unhealthy competition, and we should be breeding cooperation. Sister Liguori was my Latin teacher in 9th grade who bred competition like a master. She also spiced it with fear. And she would give a test every day on the previous day. And the following day, after the test, she would hand those tests back by having each student come to the front of the class to pick up their paper in descending order of their grade. We learned Latin. Sister Liguori, principle number 1, tough enough. Life is all about healthy competition. It'll make you work harder. It will make you stronger. Welcome to the real world. I shudder when I think of Sister Liguori. Reason number 2, the non-Lake Wobegon reason. We are not all above average, even in a very nice set of very talented students. Residency directors need some ways to distinguish the truly excellent honors from the average, high pass or pass student. How else can they choose the best among a group of talented students? Reason number 3, the trophy reason, or what's in it for me. Striving for excellence and achieving excellence in performance, being the top of the top, should be rewarded. You should get a reward not just for meeting minimal competence, but you should get an award, some recognition, and honors, a trophy for excellence. Reason number 4. This is the reason I'd like you to pay more attention to than lots of the other ones, and it's the $64,000 question. Do we really want the doctors who will be taking care of our patients, our futures, to be minimally competent, or do we really want them to be excellent? These are the people who are going to be taking care of us, our husbands, wives, significant others, life partners, parents, children, etc. Do we want them to just be competent? By striving only for competence, we risk lowering the standards, and we risk complacency with the attitude of just being good enough to pass or meet the bar. We should all strive for excellence, not just competence, to be number 1 in all things all the time. And this revisits the Sister Liguori reason, part 2. We should all strive to be number 1. Reason number 5, which is a corollary to reason number 4. If you can name that tune in 2 notes, I can name it in 1 note reason. Criterion grading might set up a race to finish first environment. We have highly competitive students. Are we prepared for students racing to get through with only reaching minimal competency and then to move on, but never really achieving true mastery by spending more time? And would that not be a substitute form of unhealthy competition, just racing to get through? Reason number 5 is probably the second most important thing that I'm going to ask you to think about, and that's the show me the data reason. Benchmarks that we set, criteria that we set can be fluffy and arbitrary, and we may choose poor criteria. There are no firm, consistent data, I think, and I welcome the comments of Dr. Nicki, about better physician or patient outcomes by setting up criterion grading. What do we want them to achieve? Has this been proven? When should they achieve it? Who makes up that timing of how long it should take? How much to achieve? Does everybody need to do the same thing? Do all our students need to come out delivering a baby if they're never going to have that opportunity? How long do they get to achieve this? And who makes that up? And finally, how do you know when it's been achieved? Do we have reliable assessment tools, especially in the non-cognitive criteria, that measure what we think we are measuring or what we are trying to measure? Show me the data. Reason number 6, the big shot, but I don't agree with you reason. I'm a nephrologist, and we need more nephrology in the curriculum. And at the risk of offending Jamie, I'll take out nephrologist, and you can substitute anything there. The geriatrician, the pediatrician, the internist, the person who wants chronic brain injury in the curriculum. Those who set the benchmarks used in criterion grading, the WHO, may be random, biased authorities who respond to old curmudgeon views or temporal trends in medical education and personal biases as to what is essential. We may not always agree with them. They have particular interests in certain areas and they are biased, and they get to set the agenda for all. Reason number 7, oh my God, have you seen the Internal Medicine Milestone Project criteria? I have that here if anybody's interested, but it's 13 pages long with assessments and criteria and minutia. Criterion grading, and especially assessments, are messy, they're complicated and incredibly long, especially when we're measuring stuff in the clinical years. This is a picture of a program director. I think it might be Gabby in there. Just overwhelmed by reams and reams of paper that will be generated by all these different criteria and assessment methods. Although the computer may make paper obsolete, it doesn't take away the headache that all of these criterion measurements will generate. Halfway done, reason number 8. This test was too hard, or that question is unfair reason. Normative grading can adjust to the difficulty of the test. If you create a really hard test, the student isn't penalized for a lower score or a poorly constructed question. Everybody is in the same boat. They all got that bad question, and you can just adjust your grade to compensate for a really tough test or a poorly constructed test. Reason number 9, the pragmatic reason. Criterion grading might cause educators to teach to the test. Not that we might not do this already, but if there are certain criteria that students must do to pass, then it's quite possible that educators will set up a curriculum that only teaches to those criterion. And a corollary to that, the students, I know how to game the testing system, reason is that it might cause students to study only to the criteria that they will be graded against. And this is sad to me because whether even more than now, intrinsic motivation or desire for deep learning, where we just create an environment that meets certain criteria and that's all. And intrinsic motivation and deep learning goes away. And for me, that makes me a little bit sad about what could come to be. Reason number 10. Yikes, look at my peers. They're outperforming me. I can and should do better reason. Anybody who's done mix-up questions and gets a wrong answer and finds out that 49% of your peers got the right answer and only 10%, and you're in one of them, chose that answer, makes you feel a little bad, like you're not good enough and you should work a little bit harder. Normative grading really lets you see how you're doing compared to your peers, locally and nationally. These are the peers. Review of personal performance in comparison to your peers. This is healthy competition, and peer pressure used positively is powerful. It may foster self-reflection and thus motivate students to learn a little bit more. Reason number 11. I know more than you do because I've been around the block already, and this applies more to students in the clinical arena. In the clinical clerkships with criterion grading, those students who do a clerkship at the end of the year would likely have an advantage over those who do the clerkship at the beginning. So if you do your surgery rotation at the end of the year, you've already had medicine, pediatrics, OB-GYN, and you're a little clinically savvy by then. So your ability to meet and exceed those criteria may be a little bit easier than somebody who takes surgery right on May 1st as the first clerkship. There is some advantage to T-steeping. The more you're in an environment, the more you learn, and the better you are, and the better you will perform. Reason number 12, the reliable and valid reason. With criterion grading, each school can set their own bar for competency. I don't know what the University of Florida is setting for their bar for competency in a particular session. It makes comparison among schools and among students from different schools very different because we won't know their bar as well. This will really drive program directors crazy when they're trying to assess and measure the difference between two students, apples and oranges. Reason number 13, that you're not good enough yet, but I have absolutely no idea what to do with you now. That's what happens when somebody fails. If somebody doesn't meet the bar and continues not to meet the bar, what are we going to do? What do you do at the end of an educational experience, a course, a block, a clerkship, all 4 years, if someone has not met all of your criteria, presumably of equal weight, for mastery? Remediation would be challenging, it would be expensive for the school and for the student who already has accrued significant debt, and downright embarrassing. And finally, reason number 14, if it ain't broke, don't fix it reason. Normative grading is the way we've been doing things for years. We've turned out some excellent physicians and scientists from medical schools. You'll have to prove to me that going through all of this is educationally sound, that we have better outcomes for our students, we create better doctors, which leads to better patients and a healthier society. You'll have to prove to me that going through all this is administratively and financially possible, and you'll have to prove to me that this is logistically feasible. Recall just the internal medicine milestone project. I can't imagine what it would look like in medical school for 4 years. I would ask the data to be presented that shows me that changing a system gives better outcomes. And finally, for those of you who were here at the start, you'll recognize that the answer to the great debate question is obviously the toilet paper gets put on so that it's from the top. There's just no two ways about it. And now I turn it over to Dr. Elmer.
So how do I get out of this?
It would help, wouldn't it? I sabotaged you. I think it's pretty cool that I know how to do the computer. Oops. Go back one. No, it's forward.
All right. So those were great comments, Roseanne. So I would hear the other side of the coin, and I'll talk to you about the criterion-based system. And when Roseanne actually asked me to do this, I was a little nervous because I wasn't sure what sort of debate she had in mind. Whether it was going to be the more highbrow debates of the past. This is the famous Lincoln-Douglas debate back in the 1850s, or if this would be more of the more lowbrow debate that we've come to know in more modern times. You can tell who grew up in a certain time because you don't need to say anything more. So you can just fill it in your head, right? And then keeping with the Saturday Night Live motif, I didn't know if it'd be more the soliloquy style debate, that you also used to see, and those of us that know Roseanne, we could see her doing the other side, and you wonder, is it a coincidence? So again, just to go over a couple of these terms that we're using. So if you look up the definition of criterion, if you Google it, it's a standard or test upon which a judgment or decision can be based, and implicit in that definition is that it can stand alone, as opposed to needing support from other things. Also, remember when you talk about these things to distinguish between evaluation, which is a judgment in the quality of a performance in a specific context, like at the end of a rotation with a student or a resident, you might fill out an evaluation form that may or may not reflect a grade. Like in CAMC, we deliberately separate evaluations from grading. The preceptors all submit an evaluation, and then the committee decides on the grade that goes with that evaluation. Grading, you have a succinct summary of the overall performance, keeping in mind goal theory. People learn for different reasons, whether to achieve a grade or to achieve expertise in a certain thing. And then people have struggled with what are the goals of assessment It's funny, whenever the Canadians decide on anything, it's always the Ottawa Agreement. You always wonder that. It's Americans, it's never the Washington Agreement, but everything's the Ottawa Agreement from Canadians. And then there's an article in the New England Journal by Epstein. But if you sort through these two, they kind of agree that the 5 main goals are to guarantee minimal competency, recognize excellence, identify those who are likely to succeed. And I think that's what Roseanne's getting at, where show me the data, show me that there's predictive value in your system. Fairness and transparency. And actually, those last two have been argued in the Supreme Court in the United States, that if you have fairness, you treat everybody the same, and you make it clear what the criteria are, that you can kind of do whatever you want. This is, again, you can test how old everybody is, because if you're of a certain age, there's a song going through the back of your head right now, right? I see Missy's head going to it. So this is by Steve.
Not that I'm of that age.
Yeah, that's right. When you start getting up and dancing, that's right. So grading, what is it good for? It's by Steve Durning and Paul Hemmer. It was in Academic Medicine last year. Yeah. Jamie's the right age too, you can tell. So criterion-based does not mandate percentage of grades at each level. Rather, the grades should be awarded by meeting set criteria, which may be met by some, many, or all students. And you shouldn't be concerned if you get a skewed distribution. And they go on to say that you may wonder about your teaching ability if you have a norm-shaped curve, because why should 10 or 20% of your students be failing if you're doing a good job? So the case for criterion-based systems, you can define critical levels of achievement. You don't have to just define a minimal level of competency. You can define excellence and anything in between. It doesn't have to be a dichotomous variable. It can be an ordinal variable. And you can argue that you'll have a better learning climate. I'll come back to that in a minute. You can objectively chart learner development through time. And I'll make an argument that this is the way things are going, whether or not we like it, right? Our own personal opinions about it. So if you're one of the learners that you like to have, visual images of a criterion reference, every year you take your car in, and my VW Bug and your Porsche get the same inspection sticker, right? They go in. Is it safe to drive on the road? Yes or no? You don't get a better one when you take your Porsche in, okay? The question of learning climate. If you read Knowles is the one who wrote the book about adult learning theory. Literally wrote the book about adult learning theory. And one of his primary tenets is you need to create a comfortable environment in which to learn, and learners will learn better. And then Kelly Skeff, I think there's probably some disciples of Kelly Skeff in here now, that he's trained a lot of academicians around the country. And one of his big tenets is that you have to establish a positive learning climate. There was a paper a couple years ago that came from Mount Sinai by Haglund and her colleagues, where they demonstrate a lot of ways, both with objective criteria and with qualitative studies, that learning medicine is very stressful. That the students that they looked at met, if you used standard systems or you just looked at their comments, that they were really stressed out. Lottie Derby from the Mayo Clinic has documented at all levels of medical training how common burnout and depression are from the system. We've been trying to, as educators, push away from systems that might be more inducive to burnout and depression by introducing collaborative systems. The first was PBL, and then more recently team-based learning, where groups learn together. And it's also thought to be more reflective of how they're going to practice medicine when they get out, that you work in teams in the OR, teams in the ER, teams in the ICU or on the floors, where people share tasks and work collaboratively. There are some data that collaborative learning is less stressful and induces a better learning climate. Where do we use criterion-based systems? So this is probably the most famous, Lou Pangaro's RHYME system. He has 4 categories. He defines behaviors. I just tried to summarize them here, but if you look at the original article, he actually describes them in great detail. So you meet certain behaviors, and they're linked to learner development. They're used. This system's used around the country. It was originally designed for internal medicine clerkships, been generalized to most clinical clerkships now, and a lot of residency programs have adapted it. And in terms of data, this has been shown to be more predictive of outcomes in residency training than the standard, 1 through 5 Likert, good, better, best kind of things. Another system that we're seeing is the portfolio approach. The new school at the Cleveland Clinic uses this exclusively to evaluate their learners. There are no grades per se. The students have to master 9 competencies. And it's interesting. I had looked at this article and I was debating whether or not to put it into this talk. And then we were interviewing intern candidates, and I interviewed a woman from this school, and she was just glowing and effusive in her description of this system, how much she loved it, how glad she was that she had gone there, and how well their graduates have done in residency programs. And she just gushed. I kind of took the cork off the bottle, and she just gushed this stuff out for about 20 minutes. But it was okay. It was timely, So they master these 9 competencies. They're reviewed on a regular basis. They're reviewed yearly for promotion. She said the vast majority of them are promoted. She commented on the learning climate. They have no class ranks, no AOA. Their exams are formative only. I mean, they're meant to give you feedback and improve your performance. She said the system, she volunteered this, and this is one of the big tenets of the article, that the system promoted collaboration. They all take their USMLE steps, and none of their students have failed any of the USMLE steps up to now. So it's a pretty impressive achievement. Competency-based assessment is the way of the future, like it or not. That's the way we're going. I think Tom Nask is going to tell you that when he's here. The first was the ACGME competencies that we've all memorized. We don't know what they mean, but we've all memorized them. And on the horizon are the milestones. We all know milestones from when we had kids, and you would chart these things, and everybody would obsess over whether the kid was walking or not yet. But now these are being adapted to residency development. And then these EPAs, which I had to look up because I couldn't remember what it stood for. I was thinking the Environmental Protection Agency that the Republicans want to get rid of. So entrustable professional activities. One of the first articles that talked about it, where you have expectations for internal medicine residents. Clinical skills and reasoning. At 6 months, they should be able to perform an accurate physical examination targeted to patients, and they go on to specific patient needs and conditions. But the idea is this is not your opinion. This is a very objective, definable target, right? So at 6 months, your intern should be able to do this. If not, something's wrong. It's like if your kid isn't sitting up and crawling, at a year, you start to get anxious, right? See all the moms going like this, The dads are all going, who cares, Just, let me know if there's something wrong, And then at 18 months, they're supposed to demonstrate how and teach. That's part of it too. The teaching part, like in Pangaros, is a higher level of development. You should be able to teach the students how to elicit findings in patients. But you see this natural progression, very objective. It has nothing to do with whether Tom can do it. It's whether I can do it, right? And that's the important thing. End of training EPAs for internal medicine residents. Again, very well defined. Manage patients with acute chronic. These are actually several EPAs that kind of squish together. Manage transitions of care, demonstrate professional behavior, and they go on to define what they mean. Again, very definable. And this is to get out of your residency training, what you should have accomplished. Some of the problems with normative systems, you can tell we're the same age because the Lake Wobegon effect came to mind right away. It's where all the children are above average, right? Fill out these things. And you tell a medical student that she's average, and you see her her face fall in front of you. Well, average is okay, that you're with a good peer group, and to be average is fine. And then you can see they're just crushed when you tell them that. So everybody expects to be above average, but they can't be. You really have to do these systems well. You have to put a lot of effort into them, and a lot of people either aren't trained or aren't willing to do it. If you read the BME review, in case you don't know, the BME reviews come out of Dundee, Scotland, and it stands for Best Evidence Medical Education. Yeah, and so they do basically meta-analyses of different educational questions, and their conclusion was that normative systems lack predictive value, as opposed to Pangaro's system, which shows good predictive value in terms of how people will do as residents. And I think normative system, if you mandate that 2 standard deviations below the mean are going to fail, it's wasteful. Similarly, because you could have a good peer group who is doing well. And we're talking about our education. I remember I took calculus in college, and the professor talked to us at the end about how he kept making the exams harder because this particular group we were in was getting all the answers right. And then he realized that his other 2 classes weren't doing the same thing, and he said, why am I trying to make the exam harder for this group to make them fail because they're just doing well, And there was a peer group effect. Similarly, you get these absurd things where you have a bad peer group, and then you could say, so you're the fastest 3-legged dog. Well, so what? What does that get you? In terms of fairness and validity, this is from Eric Alexander from Harvard, who, by the way, is a great writer. Anything he writes, I would suggest you read. Normative grades are fair only if you use identical, reliable evaluation tools, because, again, you're comparing people head-to-head. You employ uniform standards. You measure the same tasks. Everybody's getting to do the same thing. You do your surgery clerkship. If all I saw were cholecystectomies and appendectomies and you were doing thoracotomies, how could you compare us, right? And that you're done at the same developmental stage. And Roseanne mentioned the first clerkship, last clerkship phenomenon. We all struggle with that. But how can you talk about a normative system if somebody's doing it first versus last? It's much better and much easier to say they reached certain criteria. Okay, that's a much better evaluation system if you can't have people doing their tasks at the same time. So, to argue for criterion-based references, you're able to define knows and does at the critical levels that are really important. You can set the bar or bars wherever you desire. You can remove confounders, like I mentioned, peer group references, the academic year, perhaps less stressful. It's funny that Roseanne was mentioning learning Latin, because I didn't learn it from the nuns, but my Latin, it's funny who becomes a Latin teacher. My Latin teacher had been in the OSS, which is the forerunner of the CIA, and he used to tell us amusing anecdotes about breaking the necks of German, soldiers and stuff, and which kept everybody in line. I'll tell you, almost as good as the sister, And so what he used to do, though, rather than torture us and make us compete, is he would give us stories to read, either about his experiences during the war or about Roman heroes and stuff like that. We read Caesar's Gallic Wars, and we'd read them in groups, and everybody would work together and would speed up the translations and stuff when you're getting through. And so the group would get it through together. So you promote camaraderie, and you have this phenomenon of we all can succeed, right? So, but I would agree that there's one place where normative is important. I think Greg will get this, right? So when you're out walking around in the woods, it says, "Can you outrun a bear?" No, but I think I can outrun you. All right.